Welcome, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. Later we're going to be talking about giving rich white guys money to buy Teslas. But first, a name you've heard and a face you probably don't always see, Alan Prendergast from Westword. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, John.
I wanted to talk to you about your latest article on immigrants and in jails. But first, you are what's known as a long-form journalist, which, as to a dyslexic illiterate like me, means really boring journalist. But you're the last really boring journalist in town.
Thank you.
Nobody else survives doing these really long stories.
Well, you know, it's been the nature of Westword since it was started almost 40 years ago to try to have these, yes, very lengthy stories. And it was always the thing I wanted to do. They didn't call it long form when I started doing it. That's sort of the latest trendy term. But you know, the idea of narrative journalism or magazine style journalism where you really roll up your sleeves and get into a topic in some depth, and that's what I like to do.
I remember in the 90s when I was on the RTD board, you did a huge piece on the election that I ran and what was going on at RTD. I'm about halfway through
You're
it now.
almost finished.
Yeah, so it's good, but it's amazing that there's still a place for it, and thank Westword and Patty and everyone for doing that. But it's also really sad because there are no more investigative journalists that do what you do.
Well, I think
there are very few, and they're online, and therefore, since they're online and not in print, it's hard to find them, and it's hard for them to get the coverage.
Well, I think that's true. Is that long form always seemed to work better in print, and there are a few diehards who still read our print edition, but much more of the readership, as with everything else, is migrating online. But you know, I think there's a sort of weird idealism in the idea of still putting out those kind of long stories with the expectation that there are people out there with the attention span and the wherewithal to get through them. And of course,
we like to think
we don't make
people
them boring.
Who know how to read,
those kind
and went to college and care about everything,
and are looking for complex ideas as opposed to sound bites.
Well, there's a black and white world, and then there's a nuanced world, and you can't describe the nuanced world without more space.
Well, that's true, and a lot of the stories that we've tried to tackle over the years are not things that lend, I mean, ideally, the reason you're doing long form is not but to show that you can write longer, but because the story demands it.
What story, out of all the years you've been doing this, which one stands out as the most proud piece for you?
Well, there are a few. I'm very proud of the Columbine coverage because that was something we went into kicking and screaming late because the dailies had already been all over it for a while. But a lot of what they were saying did make sense. And there was a lot of cover-up, really, from the sheriff's office, the school district, about what they knew and when they knew it, and the police response that day. And a lot that needed to be learned about. I mean, it changed the way we respond to active shooter situations. But it was only after a lot of articles and a lot of people working with these victims' families to get information out over the period of years. There were some pretty interesting stories that came out of that whole debacle. Sad stories.
Let's jump into the one that you just did, which is fascinating, especially given the light of our new president and a spotlight on immigration and deportation of dangerous people. Tell me about ICE, which is Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and some of the guys that they have in jail here.
Well, ICE has its own detention center.
Where is it?
There's one in Aurora, and there's an interesting lawsuit going on there. But my story was focusing on the prisoners in state prisons who have what is known as ICE detainers, meaning when they've committed...
Sounds like a drink.
Yes. Well, what it means is when they finish doing their prison sentence, they're supposed to be deported. They have entered the country illegally. They have committed crimes here. They've been convicted in state court. But they're to be turned over to the federal government and to ICE when they complete their sentence.
So I want to make sure I'm following you. So these are people who've committed a crime. They're illegal. But instead of sending them back because they're illegal, America says no, or government says, no, you're doing time here in America. Once you're finished here in America with your time, then we're sending you back.
Right. Now, the Colorado Department of Corrections has over 1,000 inmates with ICE detainers, meaning they'll be deported as soon as they're out of prison. What's interesting is that 5 years ago, Colorado passed a law saying essentially if these aliens who committed crimes are nonviolent offenders, they should be considered what is called presumptive parole, meaning when they're up for parole, they should get it because they're going to be deported immediately. And this will help free up the prison system from some pretty expensive costs associated with keeping these people housed here. Out of that 1,000, there's probably, well, I know there's over 400 that are eligible for parole and haven't gotten it, meaning they've been turned down for parole.
So let's see about, first, point of clarification.
Yeah.
They're in federal prison?
They're in state prison.
They're in state prison, all right.
They're in Canyon City, they're in Lyman, they're in one of the facilities.
This seems like a pretty sensible thing that, if these guys were kiting checks, or got caught with too many drugs on them, but they weren't selling them, whatever. Once they're up for parole, the idea is just give them parole, because once you give them parole, ICE takes them, sends them back. Why keep them in prison here when they can be Mexico's problem and off of our books?
And this is
that makes sense.
Yes. Well, and I got a letter from an inmate. He's from Honduras. He's a nonviolent drug offender. He's doing his sentence here. He's got no disciplinary write-ups. He was up for parole recently and was turned down. And his question is, wait a minute, President Trump, I'm exactly the kind of guy President Trump wants out of the country. Why is the state of Colorado stopping this? Now presumably he obviously thinks he'd be better off deported than in doing time here.
Are they all like that, though? I mean, are there people who would prefer to be in an American prison than going back to their home country?
I suspect most of them would share his sentiments. Now, some of them, there are good reasons they're not getting paroled. If they committed a really violent offense, we've got some, out of that 1,000, there may be...
But the law's not for that person.
No.
Because if they're a violent
they
criminal,
don't get the presumption.
They don't get the presumption.
Right.
So we're only talking about people who did something like a drug crime or kiting checks or stealing something, and we just want them gone.
Yes, I mean, the reason for doing the story is I think that the parole board's decisions on this is costing us millions of dollars, and it's ignoring this law. But I'm not getting a good explanation about why this continues to be the fact. Of course, there are some built-in incentives to keep them here.
Like what? I'm sorry,
well,
I'm not seeing
it. Let's say you're in the private prison industry. We have some private prisons in Colorado that are struggling to stay open. If the current prison population dips any further, they may have to close more of those prisons.
But the parole board isn't a bunch of officers from private prisons.
The parole board,
the private prison doesn't make that decision.
No, the parole board has its own discretion about all these, and they probably have an explanation in each and every case why they turn down someone's parole.
What? And are you suggesting they're in bed with the private prisons?
I'm suggesting that there are certain incentives to probably keep some of these guys here. I don't think it's a conscious decision on the part of the parole board, but I think the parole board, in its own way, is not as concerned about getting these guys out of the country as you and I might be.
All right, but you mentioned the private prisons.
Yes.
I'm missing the crossover there. Does the parole board subconsciously want to help these prisons? What? I don't think so.
I'm not going to psychoanalyze what their subconscious desires are.
What is the incentive for them versus vis-a-vis private prisons?
Well, I'll try to answer that.
And I know you can only speculate, so let me make that clear.
Parole boards, in general, have very tough jobs. I would not want to trade places with those folks. They get to go to the garden spots of Colorado, all these prisons on the Eastern Plains, and make these tough decisions that we all get to second guess about why people get out or don't get out. But the fact is, they usually err on the side of caution. And in fact, I think there's a whole culture built around that in the parole board, in the prison system, that makes discretionary parole difficult. More and more, you're seeing that a lot of prisoners don't get out till their mandatory release date. Now, in some cases, that's a public safety issue, and I'm not sure that's the case in every issue.
But in this particular case, or in these cases, the law is a presumed parole, or when you're up for it, get them the hell out of here. Was there any enforcement mechanism in this law, or was it just a...
I think they go back and analyze it every year, and they say, well, we are giving more, we are releasing more of them. I mean, to be fair, we have about a third less of those prisoners with ICE detainers than we had before that law was passed. So it must be working to some degree. My question, which I haven't been able to get an answer to, is why do we still have hundreds that seem to qualify under this law who are not getting deported?
And the cost to keep somebody in prison is close to, what, 40 grand a year,
Yes.
something like that? So you're telling me there's 400 of them, at $400,000 a year, or 40 grand a year.
I estimate that, well, first of all, the total number with the ICE detainers is probably about 37 million a year. And of that, maybe about 40% could be paroled. And deported.
Right. Yeah. It's not parole.
It's not freedom.
It's not parole to wander your streets.
Right.
It's parole to go back where they came.
There is another side to this argument, which says, but they'll come back. Prosecutors often argue.
Not with a wall, my friend.
Well,
that's why they're still in prison. They are paying for the wall,
well,
not with the wall.
The same inmate that I mentioned
Right.
in his letter also said, I have no intention of coming back. And besides, Mr. Trump is going to build a wall. So I'm not coming back. I don't know if we can be that confident, but I do think that the recidivism rate for the ICE detainers is near zero. Very few of them end up back in the Colorado prison system. That doesn't mean they don't end up trying to sneak back into the country.
It just means maybe they don't get caught.
That could mean that too.
Do you think the legislature is aware that the law that they created, when did they do this?
In 2011.
2011, so pretty recently, is being ignored or partially ignored?
I think they have some awareness of that, but because the parole board does go through in its annual report and explain how many of these detainers they're actually addressing, but they don't really give an explanation of why the ones who aren't being released. So I think they're aware that it's not working perfectly. I think they're also maybe relieved that at least a third of them have been, we've had this 33% reduction over 5 years.
Well, it goes along with the sentencing reform that's been happening all around the country when it says it doesn't make sense to keep drug offenders in jail if they're nonviolent, get them out. And this seems to be an extra incentive, not only get them out of jail, but get them out of the country.
Well, and Colorado has had several significant reforms aimed at trying to reduce the prison population, get a lot of the people who are not a public safety risk into a less expensive arrangement with the criminal justice system, whether it's a diversion program or parole or something else.
Very last question. You work for Westword, which means you answer to Patty Calhoun. What kind of slave driver is she? Is she as awful as we've heard?
She's every bit as fearsome as you think. But I will also say she's the main reason I've been at Westword as long as I have, is the relationship I have with her, and I get very little interference with what I do. The fact that she's been there 40 years is also a remarkable thing.
So what I'm hearing is you got some photographs.
Yeah,
you got some black and whites.
I won't talk about what exactly I got, but we have a very good working relationship.
Alan, thank you. You want to listen, read that story, westword.com. Stay tuned.